You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today, well, Christian apologetics is a favorite topic of mine, as you can imagine. And today we're combining it with another favorite topic of mine, which you might think, how can these two be related? Well, we're going to find out how. And that's video games. See, it started a few months ago. Someone gifted me a copy of the book Console Wars on the Kindle, which was about the battle between Nintendo and Sega, the battle that defined a generation. And indeed it did. I was a Nintendo guy all the way through, okay, just so you know where I stood. And today in our house we have Nintendo products, but we also have a PlayStation 4. We'll be getting into that soon. But in the book, before too long, Christianity does show up. Like, you read that the game Castlevania was called that because the original name was to be Dracula's Satanic Castle, and there was a Christian at Konami that said, no, we're not doing that. And he stayed in the gaming business until Mortal Kombat came out, and then he said, you can't do this now. But Christianity did have a great impact on what was going on. So I thought, why not do a show on this kind of topic? So I looked and said, are there any real scholars out there, PhDs and such, who are actually doing something on Christianity and video games? Well, I found one. And I got in touch with him, and he sent me his book, and he was very happy to come on. His name is Kevin Schut. He's the Associate Dean of the School of the Arts, Media, and Culture, and Professor of Media and Communication at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, Canada. He's the author of the book Of Games and God, a Christian exploration of video games, which is what we're talking about today. And he spends his spare time playing Mario Kart, King's Quest, and Overcooked with his 3 daughters. Dr. Scott, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I hope we're not interrupting your gaming time.
No. I don't spend all day long gaming, just a part of each day.
Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing, in case my audience doesn't know who you are.
Yeah, so I was teaching at schools for missionary kids overseas in the late 90s and teaching high schoolers. And I thought, actually, I kind of want to teach at a higher level as much as I'm enjoying the high school level. And so I started looking into graduate programs. And I'd initially thought about getting into history, and one of my old professors talked me into doing communication studies. And so when I went to graduate school at University of Iowa, I had a very vague idea of what I was going to do. I was interested when I was an undergrad in studying Disney a little bit, and I thought, well, maybe I'll do something with that. But I didn't have any real ideas, and I didn't have any theories that I was interested in. I didn't really know much of anything. And in one of my very first classes, one of my favorite professors, one of the people who turned out to be one of my favorite professors, got up and looked around the room, and a lot of us were newer graduate students, and he said, you're going to be doing this for a long time. You're going to be studying for a long time. So if you're going to study something you love. And that was the moment where I stopped and I thought, I wonder if they let you study computer games. And it turns out that they do.
Wow.
So I, at that time, I thought, well, maybe I should look into this. Is there any academic work on this? And as it turns out, that was when the academic field that today is called game studies was really just starting up. And so ever since the early 2000s, I have been reading and writing and publishing in the area of game studies, and basically just looking at media, and specifically what video games have to tell us about how our culture is shifting, and and what it means. And I actually started working on Of Games and God after one of my former professors at Calvin College suggested, well, there's not a lot of Christian writing in this area, so maybe this is something that you should look at. And so that's what I published in the very end of 2012, early 2013. So that's where the book comes from as well.
And no doubt this research requires a whole lot of first-hand experience on the topic, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You can't study something that you don't touch. So yes, I do. I do play games, yes.
We appreciate your sacrifice for the kingdom.
Yes, thank you.
Now, I understand that you've usually begun your classes asking students what games they're playing. So I figured maybe if you want some insight into where I'm coming from with this, I could tell you what games I'm currently playing right now. And I don't know if there was any connection between them all and such, but maybe we can find something.
Right.
But I usually do play word games like Words with Friends, Word Streak, and Hanging with Friends.
Right.
And I still play Pokemon Go, but for main games I'm focusing on right now, on my phone, I'm playing Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. On my computer that I've got downloaded from Steam, I'm playing Final Fantasy 13, and on the PSP, since I'm playing that for handheld right now, I'm playing the sequel to Final Fantasy Dissidia, Final Fantasy Ducidium, something of that sort. So now, I'm not sure if there's any connection between all of those games, but maybe if we could look closely, we could find something.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're a Final Fantasy fan.
Which is exactly why we have a PlayStation 4.
Yes.
Final Fantasy and
great.
Kingdom Hearts, exactly.
There we go.
Yeah. For me, I've been playing video games as long as I can remember on system. I don't think you mentioned in the book, but the old ColecoVision system.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually have one at the university. I have a collection of old game systems that I bring out when I teach my video games in culture course, and we're doing that right now. And there's a ColecoVision in my building right now, right next to the Atari and the Intellivision as well.
If you set me down in front of a game Ladybug, you will never see me again. Now, you talked about the intersection of games and culture, so I'd like to read you this paragraph that you talked about that you found in an article here, talking about how society is filled with new technology and such. Video games are not understood by the present generation of adults. They are new, they make an enormous appeal to children, and they present ideas and situations that parents may not like. Consequently, when parents think of the welfare of their children who are exposed to these comparing situations, they wonder about the effects of games upon the ideals and behaviors of their children. Do the games really influence children in any direction? Are their conduct, ideals, and attitudes affected by the games? Are there parts which are objectionable to adults understood by children, or at least by very young children? Do children eventually become sophisticated and grow superior to games? Are the emotions of children harmfully excited? In short, just what effect do video games have upon children of different ages? That's a pretty hard critique, and I mean, we've all heard some before, so when does this come from? Is it 1990s, 2000s? When is it exactly?
Well, I love that quote because, as you know, if you've read the book, that comes from the 1930s, and it's not actually about video games; it's about films, which tells you something because it sounds exactly like something that you would have heard in the last even 10 years. It wouldn't have been surprising to hear something like that, and yet we've been saying things kind of like that for at least 80 years, and really you could probably find similar critiques more than 100 years ago in the late 1800s when people were complaining about dime novels, westerns. There were people that were worried about the effect of westerns on young people as well. And so I love that quote simply because it shows us that in some ways what we're dealing with is not, culturally speaking, all that new.
Yeah. Now, of course, we do want to be careful with all this. We're not going to be getting up here and saying, hey, video games, anything goes, all's good as long as you enjoy it. But at the same time, we don't want to stand and say, everything is of the devil and you must get rid of it right now.
Absolutely.
And I like that you point out that something being Christian doesn't mean that it has to, for instance, explicitly mention Jesus numerous times. My wife was listening to something You Make the Dead Come Alive. Eric Reddy, I think, does it. And she said, featuring 21 artists. And I thought, that name sounds familiar. I'm sure I've heard it before. And they're actually a popular band we've heard on the local secular radio station. And they're singing a secular song. But every member of the band, it says, past and present, is a Christian. And their songs have a lot of Christian theology. But if you listen, you're not going to hear Jesus mentioned once.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's the same kind of thing when we're looking at any culture. The real measure is not always a question of explicit mention of theological concepts, but is this culture that helps us to build the kingdom? Is this culture that helps us to understand love and healing and health and forgiveness and the kinds of things that God's kingdom is built around? Or does it hurt us in that regard? And we could even argue that some things that explicitly mention Jesus are not always as helpful as they think as they seem to be on the surface. So it's really important that we not make it a litmus test of how many times you mention the word Jesus or the church or God or anything like that, but more a question of is this a piece of culture that is about healing, about love, about health, about joy, about self-control, the fruits of the Spirit, right?
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking the works of the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Muslims, they mention Jesus several times, but you're certainly not going to find good things that would build you up for the kingdom of God there.
Yeah, it depends on what exactly you're talking about, but that often even people who are Christians will say things that are not always helpful, and because we are not perfect, and not everything that we do as Christians is perfect, and so I think it's important that we don't tie ourselves down to an unrealistic standard.
So, since we're talking about video games, I want to ask a question that could seem pretty obvious, but at the same time, could be pretty complex. If we're going to understand video games, I think what we need to ask first is, what is a video game?
Well, it's funny. I just did a lecture on this the other day, but we'll keep it short. So games in general are systems of rules that are operated by players in order to achieve a goal, basically. So if you think about any kind of game like a Monopoly or a chess or something like that.
A sporting event even.
Yeah, absolutely. Board games. There's parts, pieces. And if we're talking about a video game, it's, think Mario Kart or Tetris. There are pieces in the game. There are objects in the game. And they're not things that you can just do whatever you want with. They're governed by artificial rules, right? And the goal of interacting in that game is to produce a particular kind of outcome. So in Mario Kart, you want to win the game. In Tetris, you want to get a high score. And in chess, you want to defeat the other person. I think that there are some games that are sort of, don't always fall into a neat definition. I mean, you look at a role-playing game, and often, especially open-ended role-playing games like massively multiplayer online games, they don't have an end condition. It's not like it ever stops. But there's little things that you can constantly go towards. I want this piece of armor, or I want to build this for my guild, or I want to, finish this raid, or whatever.
Gain this lever.
Yeah, and all of those things are part of a game. So video games are that, and then to make it a video game as opposed to a game in general, usually we're assuming there's some kind of computer involved. I mean, strictly speaking, a video game should involve a screen, but what's kind of interesting is there are some computerized games that are audio only, and those are very unusual, but they still do exist, and I would argue that they still sort of count under the same sort of level as video games. Usually a video game involves a computer in some way, basically. Right. A game involves a computer in some way, and there are actually some really interesting games that sort of are a mix of real life and computer, where the computer gives you instructions and you go somewhere in real life. So that's another kind of hybrid sort of thing. The whole field of alternate reality games, where they take reality and put some extra graphics or a story over top of it. And is that a computer game or is that a video game or not? And that's a bit debatable, but the bulk of what we're talking about when we're talking about a video game is a system of rules with interacting parts that has players, quantifiable outcomes, and you need a computer to play it, basically, some kind of computer.
Yeah, when you talk about the hybrid games, I did think of Pokemon Go immediately.
Yes, that's a great example. Yeah.
And, I think that some people who say they might have never played a video game or such, if they're sitting down, they're playing Words with Friends or someone, they're technically playing a video game, aren't they?
Yes, they are. It's really just Scrabble, right? In a computer form, but that doesn't mean that it's not a video game because it involves a computer, and especially, the key with Words with Friends is that you can play people from all over the world, and that wouldn't be possible without the computer. So that's pretty important.
Now, I'm thinking of going to the mall after this interview today. I understand it's Batman Day, and my wife wants me to pick up a free comic, especially since it includes Harley Quinn. By the way, this is assuming that the Christian numerologists are wrong, the world doesn't come to an end today. I'm not really counting on that. But
okay.
Let's suppose I'm here at the mall, and I go into GameStop, and I get a game, and I come home, which isn't likely to happen. We don't have it on my back. I get home, and I stick it in my PS4 or whatever and decide to play it. How should I begin evaluating this game?
Well, gosh, there's so many different ways to do it. I think the important thing to start with is that there isn't a single right way for Christians to interact with video games, because there are so many different games. And I think that depending on where we are in our life and at that particular moment in time, we appreciate the same thing in different ways, and they can have different impacts on us. So I don't think that there's one right way to do it, but I can suggest some of the things that I would be sort of thinking about as I'm playing the game.
Okay.
So when I'm playing a game, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the actual artistic quality of the game itself. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about, is this a well-made game? Are there good mechanics? Is it polished? Is it fun to play? Or is it thought-provoking? Because not all games are fun, but they're still good sometimes. Is this a piece of good craftsmanship? And I think that, as a Christian, I think one of the things that we are called to is excellence, and that includes artistic excellence. And there are games that are well made, and there are games that are not well made. And I think that that's something that spiritually Christians should not be afraid to evaluate. Looking at a game and saying it's well made. Now, that's not where the evaluation should stop. And I think for many gamers, that is where the evaluation stops. Is it an enjoyable thing to play? Is it well made? Is it well crafted? I think we have to think beyond that as well. So then I think about the stories and the world that the game evokes, and there we get into a much fuzzier kind of thing where there's not like a list of things to check off, but I'm sort of evaluating what kind of world does the game evoke or create or allow the player to travel through, and what kinds of stories is it telling in that world? And those are two actually distinct things. The game world is sort of the environment, the people that are there, the atmosphere that it creates. I would argue that every game has a world, even simple ones like Tetris is just falling blocks from the sky. It's not a particularly complex world. If you play, Elder Scrolls Skyrim or Final Fantasy or something like that, those are giant sprawling worlds with lots of characters in different imaginary locations. And so they're quite a bit different. But I would argue that all games, even the simplest, have a world. And that world has a kind of atmosphere, and it can often have a certain set of messages to it. When a world works a certain way or not, and not another way, it's a comment, or it's something that teaches or encourages us to think in a particular direction. So I'm looking at the world, and then of course I'm looking at the story. And in this sense, it's no different than watching a movie or a television show or reading a book or something like that, reading a novel or a graphic novel. I'm looking at the narrative as well. And when I'm looking at this world and when I'm looking at this narrative, I'm again measuring it against the kinds of things that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. Is this a world or a story that encourages peace, that encourages love, that encourages healing, that encourages forgiveness, that encourages self-control, that encourages joy, that encourages creativity? And is it doing those things? And it's important to note that that doesn't mean that that a game has to have a happy theme to be worthwhile. The fact is that in this life we encounter a lot of suffering and we encounter a lot of difficulty, and our art should be grappling with that. And so that means that there will be games that are worth playing that do ultimately encourage the growth of healthy habits and virtues and attitudes, and on the surface of it look pretty dark. And so I'm not necessarily, for example, against the genre of horror games, even though personally I will say that I can't do horror myself. I'm just too sensitive. They freak me out and I can't play them. But
I understood.
Yeah. But I think in many ways horror grapples with evil in a very powerful way, in a very stark way, in a way that does not shove evil under the carpet, but sort of faces it head on. And I think that sometimes, anyways, it can be done in a way that encourages us to really identify evil in our lives and in our world, and help us to live better because of that. So I look for the world, I look for the stories, I look for whether it's in tune with those themes, and then of course, when I do find traces of ideas and themes that are very clearly spiritual, that also is something that I consider. Where what kind of religious narrative is it weaving, underneath the story, and there are games that very much the Western literature as a whole, whether we're talking about games or novels or movies, often have Christ-like themes, stories of sacrifice, and that evoke the Christ story, because Western culture has been so heavily influenced by the Christian story, and so you can see things like that in games as well. They're rarely very perfect metaphors, but there's often some echoes, anyways, of Christian stories that I think can be really positive and powerful as well. So those are all things that I look for. There's a lot more to talk about than that. I mean, if you look at the book, of course, every chapter sort of deals with a different topic. But those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in general when I'm playing games.
Yeah, something I'm also thinking about at this point is, what happens if, can you get to enjoy a game as a good Christian, even if you don't agree with a lot of its main message and such? I mean, for me, one key example would be Final Fantasy X. When this one was coming out, I remember reading a story about the young Blitzball player named Tidus, who's caught in a battle where he has to stop this mindless destroying force from taking over a world called Sin. And I thought, well, did I read that correctly? And I read it again, and yeah, the enemy is sin this time, and how incredible that was. Now, I enjoy Final Fantasy X very, very much, but at the same time, its answer to the question of sin was terrible. It's not a Christian answer. And something I've noticed with the Final Fantasy games is usually whenever the church shows up in Final Fantasy, it's evil somewhere. And I think, I still enjoy the game, but I'm also thinking, if Japan keeps seeing the church as evil here, maybe we should, learn something from this.
Yes, absolutely, and this is really important to me as a Christian in general. There's two things I can say about that. First of all, there are things that Christians can learn from people who are not Christian. And positive things. I do not view people from other religious faiths as my enemies. I view them as people who maybe understand God in a different way, and I hope that that we can come to a closer agreement at some point. But they often are holding some part of the truth, and we should be open to that, to listening to that. That doesn't mean that we're shedding our own Christian faith in the process, but most major world religions, for example, preach that we shouldn't be murdering people. That is something that we agree on, right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that we can learn things from other perspectives, but I also think that even when it is something that we disagree with, as you say, we do need to be able to listen to that, and we need to be able to understand that, because we need to understand where they are and what they're thinking and what they're believing in order to be able to speak to them, and to be able to treat them as full human beings, as they are. They're all children of God. And we need to be talking to them. And I think Christians are so afraid of, how do I say this? There are reasons to be afraid of messages in the media, the good reasons, and reasons that we should be cautious and careful with what's happening in the media, because yes, we can be led astray. We can, go in directions that are not particularly healthy and happy. But at the same time, I think that that fear keeps many Christians from engaging things that will help them be in the world better, that will help them. We are not supposed to be of the world, but we are supposed to be in there, and we're supposed to be able to talk with people and be able to understand them and to be able to speak with them where they are. And I think that sometimes when we see something that is either non-Christian or in some cases anti-Christian, our first impulse is to cover our eyes and close our ears, and because we're worried about corruption. My personal feeling is that if we are strong in the faith and the Holy Spirit is with us, that we need to be able to engage those things and understand them. And as you say, looking at Final Fantasy and a lot of the Japanese games do very interesting and to Westernize very strange mergings of different religions, a sort of syncretist kind of approach to things that I would never follow. But it's interesting to see that, because it helps you understand where Japanese culture is. There's this deep interest in spirituality, but they're not. When you play those games and you really look at them seriously, like you did with Final Fantasy X, you understand something about that culture's distrust of institutional religion. And if you were going to go and talk to that culture as a Christian, that's very, very important and useful information to know. So, I don't think we should run away from this stuff. I do think that there are times when maybe we should avoid it, for sure, and we have to sort of measure our own weaknesses, but as an individual and as a community. But I think that generally speaking, we should be able to play those games, and we should be able to recognize that often they're very beautiful and powerful pieces of art, right? Like Final Fantasy X is a well done game. I haven't played that one myself, but I've read enough reviews and enough about it to know that it's a very, very well done game. We should be able to enjoy that while critically engaging the stuff that we don't necessarily agree with.
My parents got me Final Fantasy 15 for Christmas, and when I watched me play it, we'd be looking and think, wow, these graphics, this is so incredible and such.
Yes, absolutely. Terrible
story in that one, but the game itself was very good. And, something I'm thinking about while I was talking about how the Japanese do things. I think it's worth knowing that it's a shame that the Japanese people reach so many with their culture, and we have so little Christian emphasis on sending missionaries and such to Japan, but less than 1% of Japan is Christian. That's a major lacking, I think, on our part.
Yes, well, there's a long history with that, and we could do an entire podcast on that. The history of Christianity in Japan has been a very troubled one, and a lot of difficult moves. It's a difficult place to do evangelization, and you can see that in the video game culture too.
Yep.
We have had Japanese Christian students at our university, at Trinity Western University in BC, and it's a very different kind of culture, and learning to evangelize there is lifetime's work, I would say. Absolutely.
Now let's talk about other themes also. With other games like, say, Legend of Zelda, as well, one of the essential classics of video games, may I add. And to this day, I've still yet to play Breath of the Wild because we don't have a system for it yet. We can't afford it. And excuse me while I go mourn a few minutes here over the great sorrow that I'm having in my life right now. But I mean, and something else that I read in your book was how you would stay up late, I think, in college playing Magic the Gathering with your friends and such, which is exactly what I was playing in high school as well. So that gives us to us, I mean, you talk about spirituality. A lot of these games have magic. Should we be concerned?
Well, it depends on what you mean. It depends on what kind of game we're talking about and what kind of magic we're talking about and how the game handles it and things like that. But in general, my experience has been no. And this is not a denial of the reality of spiritual forces, just so that we're all clear.
Right.
I do believe that there are dark spiritual forces, and I believe that the Bible makes it pretty clear, and Christian tradition makes it pretty clear that, real magic is something that is not a healthy spiritual thing for Christians. And I mean, there's any number of reasons why we could make that case. I mean, I think that one of the biggest conceits of magic in real life is that it turns spirituality into technology, essentially. That if I, push this button, I get this result. And magic is the same kind of thing, to control spiritual forces in order to achieve what we want. And that's a conceit that denies the sovereignty of God. And so that's, in real life, I think that's a concern. But magic in stories and magic in games is a different sort of thing. There's often a sort of superficial resemblance between, what people try to do in a game with magic and what people try to do in real life. But I think that that what we actually see in most games is is not anything like real magic. Most games that have magic and spells have things that you can actually manipulate as a player. Well, anything that you can actually manipulate as a player in a game is a piece of code, which means that it's quantified. It's a set of numbers. And if you actually look at most video games that have magic in them, they have things like duration and effect range and effect area and how many mana points it costs and things like that. That's not magic. That is, in fact, technology at that point. It's closer to an actuarial table from an insurance company than it is, real magic. There's nothing spiritual or mystical about it. You could just as easily replace it with a gun, and it would functionally be the same way. It's just dressed up a little bit differently. I also think that there's a strong tradition of magic in a literary sense, of being a way for us to grapple with wonder, with mystery in stories. And so, you look at the works of someone like C.S. Lewis, who was a thoroughgoing Christian, and he leaned on this ancient pagan mythological tradition and saw no discordance there with his own faith, writing his own explicitly Christian books using some of the same themes. I mean, there's all these Greek mythological figures in his works, and some Nordic ones as well. And magic was a way of playing, creatively with an imaginary world. And I guess the other argument that people will often bring in is that, well, if you play with magic in a game, then you get confused with reality. And there's very, very, very little evidence that suggests that in fact happens on anything like close to a regular basis. Mm-hmm. When we find examples of people confusing fantasy and reality, whether it be a movie or a game or anything else, it's almost always related to a very strong mental illness. which then brings up the whole question of is it the book, is it the game, or is it in fact the mental illness that's to blame here? And I would argue that it's the latter in most cases. So I think that we can look at games with magic and themes of magic, and I think they can be very positive to interact with. They can be creative and imaginative. I think where we need to be careful is that some games have very dark spiritual themes, and spiritual themes that dwell on decay, on despair, on horror. And again, horror can point us to the reality of evil and therefore help us change in everyday life. But I think sometimes there's a sort of an unhealthy fascination with it, like it's a really cool thing in and of itself. And whenever magic or any theme in a video game points in that direction, I think we're heading in an unhealthy direction. And I think that that can be an issue with spiritual themes in games, where there's a sort of unhealthy fascination with the darkness, and that's a problem. So I'm not saying that it's never a problem, but at the same time, I think that there is space for Christians to engage magic in games, and for it to be a positive thing.
I'm hearing this, and I'm thinking a couple of things. First off, that this can apply to any form of media, books,
absolutely,
TV, anything. And second, when you talk about the stories being made up and such, I immediately thought of the famous Porting Report. I was supposed to have all these connections between Dungeons and Dragons and Satanism, and I've even heard that the person who made Dungeons and Dragons is actually a Christian as well. And so many people still live by that, like it's a golden standard. I mean, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I never started thinking that way.
Right. Yeah. And I think there was some misunderstanding and a lot of social panic. That quote that we had at the beginning about video games, parents don't understand them, and all the rest of that stuff, and found out it's from the 1930s. This pattern is something that shows up every time a new cultural phenomenon shows up, that there is both an enthusiastic embrace of it, and then also this really like knee-jerk reaction of, oh my goodness, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to our culture. And the same thing happened with Dungeons and Dragons. It was this new thing. People didn't fully understand it, and they reacted very negatively to it. And I think what a lot of people misunderstood is they thought that the players actually, engaged in magic themselves rather than telling a story about an imaginary world in which there is magic. And in fact, some of the early manuals sort of blur the lines a little bit in some of their descriptive portions, but I don't know of any role-playing gamers who ever actually did anything like that, and I've never heard of any reports of that. So no, I do not think that it was leading Christians down a dark path in the way that many of the advocates said. I think that a lot of that was often based on a misunderstanding of what role-playing game was like.
And if we're going to be talking about Christian character in video games, there's one topic that must obviously come up. That one of my favorite memories I have growing up with video games is that when I was in college, my brother-in-law got me together one day with him and two of his friends, and we ended up playing GoldenEye together all day. And the whole classic shoot 'em up. And when I got a Street Fighter 2 Turbo for Christmas, my brother-in-law played about 70 or 75 rounds or so immediately. And when it came to my bachelor party, I had one of the tamest bachelor parties in the world, I'm sure, by comparison, because we got together at the apartment of one of my best man. He lived in this fancy apartment. He was hired as a living assistant with someone. They had a big screen there. We played Super Smash Brothers Brawl all evening long. Now, all of it sounds like fun, but some people are saying those games are violent. Violence shows up in video games so much. How can this be a good thing? Yes.
And that is one of the two major issues that and I'm sure we're going to get to the other one in a bit.
Oh, yes.
The two major issues that I, when I speak about video games, that comes up the most often and there's good reason for it. As you say, violence is in fact a reality of video games, and there's lots of interesting theories about why that's the case. One of the arguments is that, especially in the early days of video games, the computers were not very powerful, and so you really had to design fairly simple games. And it's very simple to determine whether something is there or not. It exists or it doesn't exist. And so combat, where you kill something, it's there and then it's not, is a very simple thing to design. It's a very simple thing to program. And so that's where that theme came from. But I think you can even look further historically. One of the big roots of video gaming is the wargaming culture, and wargaming culture, has military roots, and so that's another possible reason for it. Association in our culture between masculinity and violence, and video games are very masculine, have traditionally been a very masculine area. So yeah, it's an important thing to deal with, because it is something that, if you look at the bestsellers, you look at what people are playing, there's frequently violence. Before I jump into that, I should note that there are a ton of nonviolent video games out there, a ton of good nonviolent video games. And if you really wanted to, you could spend the rest of your life just with the video games that have been made already that are nonviolent, and you would never lack for games. There's just that many out there. And in fact, some people would say, well, maybe they're out there, but they don't, sell that well. Well, that's actually not true. A game like Grand Theft Auto makes headlines because, yes, it is like one of the biggest selling games of all time, kind of thing. But it's not the only big seller, right? Tetris is seriously one of the greatest franchises in video game history, and it is completely and utterly nonviolent, right? And there are a ton of games that have very, very moderate, very tiny amounts of violence. So, for example, sorry?
Angry Birds.
Yeah, Angry Birds is trivial violence, I would say, in that case, or even like Pac-Man, right? You're going around a maze, and yes, technically, when the ghost hits you, there's some violence there, and when you eat the ghost, there's some violence there. But that's a very loose definition of violence at that point, right? It's not very graphic. And a lot of games fall into that category where there's no sort of obsession with death and destruction and things like that, but it's just sort of a very small part of the experience of the game. And so people who don't know video games very well should really understand this about games, that in fact, it is a huge medium, and it's just like movies. Not all movies are the same. Not all games are the same. Not all books are the same. Not all radio programs are the same. I mean, there's diversity within the world of video games, and not all of them are violent. That having been said, violence is a common thing, and a lot of Christians play games that are pretty violent. Call of Duty. You mentioned GoldenEye is an older one, right?
Right.
A lot of us are playing Overwatch today. Overwatch is a shooter game where you go online and you're playing against other people, and it's not a particularly gory game. When you shoot people, it's not like there's showers of blood all over the place, but it's a game about shooting, right? And you eliminate people, they respawn, they come back. So that was a long way to get to the actual answer. It's important to realize that there's probably two lines of thinking that we should be going down here. And one of them is effects. What are the effects of doing this? And then the other side is what is the morality of doing this? Okay. So we'll start with the effects thing. And the short version of there's been a fair amount of research over the last decade, maybe decade and a half, on the impact of playing violent games on players and their levels of what we call aggression. And aggression is not quite the same thing as violence. Aggression is more about attitude. Violence is, do you actually hurt someone, right? And aggression is, do you have a more aggressive attitude, essentially? You're more likely to want to attack people, to want to do harm, or less patient, that kind of thing. It's very, very hard to create a connection between violent game playing and actual violence. There's just not enough violence done to know for sure if there's a really clear connection between the two. So researchers focus instead on aggression, with the assumption being that if playing violent games makes you more aggressive, it will also contribute to greater levels of actual violence, right?
Uh-huh.
And what researchers have found is hotly debated. And it really depends on who you look at. So you will look at one set of researchers and they will say that there is a clear correlation between playing violent video games and an increase in short-term aggressive attitudes, which is a lot of sort of technical science, social scientific language, but it's important to use that because you need to understand that they're not claiming a whole bunch of things by saying things that way. They're not saying that there's clear evidence, for example, that if you play violent video games that over time, eventually you will just become a more aggressive person permanently. They actually don't have very much evidence on that score. They don't know what the long-term effects of playing violent video games are. That's not to say that they're necessarily positive or necessarily negative. They simply just don't know. There is a group of researchers, though, that are firmly convinced that there's clear evidence for short-term rise in aggression. That is, you play a violent video game, and afterwards your aggression levels rise, at least for a little while, right? However, there are another group of equally credentialed psychologists and sociologists out there who absolutely believe that there is no clear evidence, that the research that the first group of researchers is relying upon is in fact deeply flawed research and is not good evidence, basically. And the debate still rages. When I wrote my book, I was doing research, about 6 years ago, 5 years ago, when I was working on this. And the debate is still going back and forth 5 years later. So it's not like the problem has been solved in the ensuing time. I am not a psychologist, so I'm not really qualified to truly evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of those various arguments. So it's hard for me to say absolutely which side is right. But I will say intuitively, and maybe you've experienced this too, Nick, that there is something to the idea that it would raise aggression levels simply because action games get your heart pounding. It's not even about shooting necessarily. It's just when you're in the middle of a really tense sequence in a game, you get on edge. I mean, that to me just seems fairly intuitive. Like I have become more aggressive and angry with games that are all about jumping rather than shooting, because I keep missing the ledge.
Yes.
Yes, you know what I mean.
The struggle is real.
Yeah. So that researchers would find that kind of connection seems to me a bit of a no-brainer. The bigger step is, does that actually spill out into everyday interactions? And again, I would say probably on an intuitive level, some level of yes, that it would encourage, in the short term, it would encourage some irritability, right? I am like this sometimes when I play a game and I'm trying very hard and I lose, I get grumpy.
Yes.
That is not a new thing. People get grumpy playing sports too, and they get grumpy because they're reading a story and their favorite character dies, or like there's any number of things like that. And I guess I would say that probably violent video games probably do have short-term effects in increasing aggression, but I'm not sure that it's such a big deal. It's not new. It's not unusual. I mean, people have read books and then gone off and assassinated people because of it. And we don't talk about, this is a problem. We really need to rethink this whole reading thing, right? I think it's fair to question on the effects of violent games, and I would say, like I'm talking to parents, I think it's pretty important to look at what your kids are doing after games. If after they play games they jump up and they start beating each other, that's maybe an indication that you need to have a conversation with your kids about, if this continues, then you're not playing these games anymore, or we're just going to restrict the amount that you're playing them, or we come up with some system that after you're done playing with these games, you have to go do quiet time for 15 or 20 minutes before you actually keep playing with each other in real. It's not it's not a straightforward recommendation one way or the other. It's just something that we need to be aware of and pay attention to. So the effects thing for me is there's a lot of common sense stuff there. And the research hasn't really given a clear indication that effects are definitely there or definitely not.
Something I've been thinking about when you talk about the short-term effects here is that if my wife and I are watching a TV show or a movie and all of a sudden here comes a powerful romance scene, I can definitely say for a few minutes after happening, honey, how would you like to just hit pause and, let's just spend some good quality time together and such. I mean, it doesn't mean she's going to say, no, honey, not now. I'm like, oh, okay, then go outside and wait for the neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that, I think that's a really, really important point, is just because stories and games and things like that have an effect on us doesn't mean that we can't control them, that we can't manage them, and that the effects are always negative. So I think that we just have to monitor. We have to be careful. We shouldn't be panicking about it, is really what I'm saying. But we also shouldn't say, well, there's nothing there, right?
Right.
So the morality question to me is a much more complicated one. And this is something that my own work is going into now. What I'm particularly interested in is what are people thinking, and what is the meaning that they're making out of the actions that they're making in games, and that's what I'm working on. One of the challenges with looking at games is that video games will allow us to do a lot of things that if they were happening in real life, we would say are immoral, right? There are a lot of games about stealing things. Stealing is wrong in everyday life, but there are a lot of games where basically that's what you're doing pretty much the entire game, right? There are games, that are all about shooting, and we would say, at the very least, Christians should be pretty cautious about shooting someone else. And there are many Christians who would argue that Christians should be pacifists. That the example of Christ is that no violence should be done by Christians in real life. I'm not a Christian pacifist myself, but I have deep respect for that position, because I think that it certainly, you can make a strong scriptural case for it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So a game like Call of Duty, where you're running around and shooting people, I know it's all military, but it's still doing an enormous amount of damage to other people. At the very least, doing that for fun as a Christian should that make us hesitate? Is that a fair question, right? And this is something I've been grappling with for years, and I haven't really totally resolved it. I mean, it's not an easy question to resolve, but I do think increasingly that a lot of it hinges on what do people understand is happening in the game, right? When we read a book and someone goes and does something in the book, whether it's good or whether it's bad, I think most people are comfortable with the idea that, morally speaking, you have not partaken in that event yourself, right? So Frodo goes and drops the ring in Mount Doom. And sorry, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read Lord of the Rings there, but Frodo drops the ring in Mount Doom. We read it or we watch it in the movies, but we don't suddenly become more virtuous because of his courage, right? Because it's someone else, right?
Yeah.
Where it gets complicated with games is that you're controlling Frodo, right? Or you're controlling Gollum, or you're controlling, Sauron, or whatever else. And so the question is then, do you partake in the morality and whether positive or negative of that character or not when you're actually doing those actions? And on the face of it, if you're not used to gaming, if you're not a gamer and you're watching someone play something and you're just watching over their shoulder, you might assume that the gamer is in fact sort of thinking that they are effectively that character, or they are partaking in that. Therefore, the actions that are happening there are then clearly, the moral value of them equates to you. So if you go and murder someone in a game, then clearly you have sort of done murder in a sense, right? And the problem with this thinking is, and this is what I would call sort of a literal interpretation of games, that what we see on the screen is literally what's happening. And the fact is that nobody actually plays games that way. It's never that simple. I mean, it's not hard to refute a basic literalist assumption, because the fact is, when I shoot someone in a game, no actual living, breathing human being actually gets hurt, or animal, or anything else, right?
Yeah.
So a shooting in a game is clearly not like shooting in real life. I mean, there's just also, just some really basic things. You're looking at a two-dimensional screen. I mean, maybe when we start getting into virtual reality, we're sort of dealing with maybe another different level again. But even in virtual reality, you don't have the feel of the air on your face. You don't have the smell of the soil. You don't that you are not in an actual different space. It's very powerful. I have a virtual reality system, but it's still distinct from real life. And the things that happen in the game don't actually impact real physical world at all. So clearly a truly literalist reading of a video game doesn't make any sense. At the same time, the images in the game you can't just totally pretend that they have no connection to real life, because if that was the case, why would you just play a game without guns? So I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, you could replace the guns in Call of Duty with, I don't know, pea shooters or candy shooters or something like that. You could do that, but nobody would want to do that because it's not cool, right?
Right.
There's a certain kind of cool associated with those military weapons. And so the fact is that there is something of a connection between that and real life, because if there wasn't, then people wouldn't be clamoring for games with guns and games with swords and games like that, right?
Right.
So clearly there's got to be some kind of connection between everyday life. So I think a lot of it hinges on, okay, so how do we understand this? And in my research, I found that people take on a lot of different frames. They have different mindsets when they're approaching games. And so sometimes they're thinking like a character in a game. So they pretend that they are actually this person, and they make choices on the basis of what that imaginary character would do. It's kind of radical empathy in a way, right? Role-playing games are like this. I wouldn't shoot someone, but my character would, so my character is going to shoot that person, right? Sometimes we think like storytellers. When we're playing a game, we want the story to go a certain way, and so we make a choice that makes for a good story. One of the people I interviewed in a project I was doing this spring said that that interesting stories feature bad choices. If you don't have people doing awful things, then it's a boring story. So I don't actually want those awful things to happen in real life, but in order to make an interesting story, I am going to make choices where my characters do awful things, because it makes for a more interesting story. There are sometimes people are often approaching games like competitors, that there is this scenario, and whatever the narrative is, I don't really care. I want to win, basically. So if I have to shoot someone to win, I'm going to shoot someone to win, and it's just about winning the game at that point. And the narrative actually doesn't matter all that much. There are people who play with what I call the tinkerer frame, or the Lego player framework. If my daughter makes a Lego dinosaur, it takes the pieces and puts it together and makes a dinosaur, and then suddenly decides, you know what? Actually, I want this to be an apple, and decapitates the dinosaur and disassembles it and turns it into an apple. We don't go, you monster! How could you kill that creature like that so heartlessly to make an apple? No, I mean it's a bunch of plastic, and you're playing with it and just to see what it can do, right? And a lot of people approach video games with the same kind of mindset. So, a classic example is in the game Fallout 3, where early in the game you're at this town built around an unexploded nuclear weapon, and the town is called Megaton. And someone comes to you and says, I'll pay you 500 caps, which early in the game is a substantial amount of money. I'll pay you 500 caps to set this detonation device on that so that I can just see it blow up for fun, which would mean killing an entire village of innocent people, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
the question is it immoral to say yes? Well, it depends on how you're thinking about the game. And if you're a tinkerer, sometimes people will play the game one way. They'll say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then they'll go back again and they'll play it and they'll say yes, just to see what happens.
Right.
Because they want to see what's in the game. It's like the Lego thing. What does the game have in it, right? What does the game have in it? And these are all frames that the gamers actually use. I've interviewed them, and I've also monitored my own way of looking at games and read other people's accounts of games. And so there's an awful lot of there's an awful lot of distancing that goes on there, and a lot of the players talked about how they sort of dissociate themselves from the narrative. Not everyone plays a game with the narrative being really realistic and real to them. And so when you see them doing violence, the moral value of those actions really changes depending on the frame that they bring into the game. So I think for people who are really worried about people doing bad actions in games, whether it be violence or theft or whatever, it's worth asking the flip side question. If you were worried about people doing bad things in games because you think that it's immoral, then are you actively positively supporting players in doing positive things in games because clearly that's virtuous? Mm-hmm. Right?
Right.
Because so often the question is just the one-way one. If you do a bad thing in a game, are you doing a bad thing? Well, let's do the flip side question. If you do a good thing in a game, are you actually doing a good thing? And most people intuitively go, well, if you save the village in a game, that's nothing. It's not real. Okay, that's probably a good argument. But if that's the case, then when you're doing a bad thing in a game, is it really such a big deal? Mm-hmm. I would argue that the weight that you give to the one, you should give to the other. And so if the answer is, well, it's very troubling when people do bad things in games because it's actually an evil action, okay, then you should be actively supporting players who want to go and do good things in games. You should be saying that will make you a better person. And if the flip side of that seems ridiculous to you, then maybe you should reconsider the whole fear of the immoral action in the game. I think often we do these things in games because we are trying to understand the world. We're trying to explore. Our fiction does this. And the only difference here is that now we are actually playing with our fiction as opposed to, sitting and reading it. But, we've told stories for ages about violence. And it's not because we want it always. It's that we need to understand it as humans. Violence is a part of our world and we need to engage it. There are healthy ways of engaging it and there are unhealthy ways of engaging it. And I think a lot of action films really go into the unhealthy side of things, where it's just cool to see people die and blow up and blood all over the place. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of games that do that too, and I think that's problematic. And I think that when Christians start celebrating violence, that's a problem. But at the same time, to say that we should never engage it, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
I'd like to remind you, when you listen to Dr. Kevin Schut here, we're talking about the book of Games and God, a Christian exploration of video games. So if you're here next week, we're going to be talking about cults. Not the cults are wrong and here's how you answer them, but how do you identify a cult and how do you escape a cult? Even more, if you have a Christian friend who's getting into a group and you're like, I'm not sure about this group, what do you do? I'm going to have Don Vaynot here from Midwest Christian Outreach, and we're going to be talking about how to identify and how to escape a cult. Even if it's explicitly Christian or Orthodox in many ways, can the thinking be something that you want to avoid? So if you're interested in that, come back next week. For now, let's get back to Dr. Kevin Schut talking about of games and God. Whenever thing I was saying about this is that the games kind of set the parameters. If I'm playing GoldenEye, I can't go in and say, I want to talk to you about what you're doing and why it's morally wrong to want to. And then a couple other examples I was thinking is from the Zelda games. When I'm playing Ocarina of Time, when I fall into Death Mountain and there's Big Dodongo there wanting to destroy me, I cannot have peace talks with a big dinosaur creature. And then if I'm playing Twilight Princess and I get to a part where the Yetta takes the part of the mirror I'm getting and suddenly gets possessed by an evil force and wants to kill me, at that point I can't say, in the name of Jesus, be gone. No, I actually have to fight these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that brings up a really good point, and this is something that we actually talked about in my research too. Mm-hmm. The players felt that there was less moral and ethical weight to games where you really didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
You either play the game or you don't, basically. So there are a lot of games where it's either shoot or be shot, and those are your only two options, basically. So you either play the game or you don't. But if you're gonna play the game, there's really no moral weight to shooting someone simply because that's the only thing you can do, basically. Yeah. I think that argument has its limits. I mean, you play a game where you go around and you use the demonic forces to possess people, and you look at a game like that and you kind of go, okay, well, the game only allows you to do that or be killed, so therefore it's okay to do it. Well, I would argue that maybe we need to seriously consider about, is that a game that you should be playing at all, right? But it is true that a lot of games have narrative premises where you just really don't have a choice. And so the moral and ethical weight of that decision is quite a bit different at that point. And I'm still, I'm honestly, I don't have I'm thinking that people might be listening to this and going, well, you should have this all figured out. You should have a clear answer. And the fact is, I don't. And I've been thinking deeply about this for years at this point. And it really does come down to this it's a gray zone. It's sort of an in-between thing. It is not like real life, but it is kind of like real life. And so I think it's one of those things that it's contextual. You have to be paying attention. Are you fascinated with the darkness of this game? Is this is the violence appealing to you? Yep. Is that why you play the game? If that is the case, then I think you have to think long and hard about that. I think that even if you really do enjoy the game, if it is something that is encouraging a kind of violent attitude, hatred towards other people, then I think you really have to seriously think about dropping that game or thinking if you can play it a different way. But I think about Overwatch, for example, that I've been playing recently. And Overwatch is like lots of other sort of fun shooter games. And the fact that it's shooting is completely incidental to me. It's all about the actual competition. It's more like a football game or a soccer game in many ways.
It's just like Mario Kart in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you don't really focus on the violence. It's not like I come away from that game feeling like I want to shoot something, or feeling like I really want to hurt someone. It's the same way when I feel very similar to after I play a game of soccer. Yeah. It's, it was a fun competition, or sometimes it's not so fun because, sometimes when you play sports games, you come away angry and upset because you didn't do well or something happened on the field that wasn't very much fun. But it's not because it's violent. It's because it's competition. And competition doesn't always go well.
And you finish a game with your buds, and you don't want to go and kill each other. You go out and get pizza together.
Yeah, exactly. And Super Smash Brothers is a great example of this. I mean, and it's a brawler, right?
Oh,
you're sitting there punching people, and you're shooting at things, or jumping around and smacking each other, holds and whatever else you do in combat games like Street Fighter or whatever. But it's so much fun to play games like that, right?
Yeah.
There's a kind of camaraderie being built, and it is very much like playing a game of dodgeball or playing a game of football or baseball or whatever it is that you're into at that point. It's that the thrill of the competition.
Yeah.
And so for me, the key with the moral and ethical questioning is, do you see yourself being taken down some dark paths mentally and spiritually by this game? And if that's the case, then you need to really seriously think about it carefully. But I do think that people, Christians who are spiritually attuned, who are, seriously critical about the things that they play, and they actually investigate themselves and they think about, what is going on here. I think that there is room for games that, on the face of it, look kind of violent.
I mean, I can say for my part, playing games like Zelda and Final Fantasy and such, over me, it's, the action, the good versus evil, and the whole idea of trying to figure out how to beat this really big villain, how to get past this stage, and it's just this big sense of accomplishment and such.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yep.
Now, let's talk then about video game addiction. I mean, we have to be clear what we're talking about here, because like I said, when Breath of the Wild came out, and again, I'm mourning here when thinking about that I still haven't got to play this game, but when it came out, I know many of my friends, very good, devout Christian friends, took a sabbatical from Facebook and pretty much everything else, and they were playing this game to see if they could finish it. Now, obviously, this is a problem of video game addiction, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's the other big one that I always end up talking about when I'm doing public talks. Unhealthy playing and violence in games, and with some good reason. Video games are, if you know anyone who is a gamer, you know that there is a tendency to want to play a lot. Because people enjoy it, and
just one more lever.
Yeah. There are a lot of reasons that people get into this stuff and don't want to stop playing, right? So there's a number of things that we need to sort of walk through here, and the first thing is this: there is no clinical definition of video game addiction. It does not exist. It is not something that is agreed upon by the American Psychological Association or the American Medical Association. And it is a fairly contested thing. Psychologists are sort of working through this, and there's a lot of disagreement within the psychological community. There does, on the other hand, seem to be fairly wide agreement that there is such a thing as problem gaming. And anyone who knows a lot of gamers will eventually know someone who is playing in an unhealthy manner.
Right.
It just, and unhealthy at different levels. Okay, so there are stories of people who lose their jobs, lose their significant others, lose so because they can't stop playing. That's a very severe case, but there are lots more stories of people who play and miss a meeting, or play and don't get to their homework, or play and that kind of stuff, which is much less severe but is very, very common. So problem gaming seems to be a thing, but true addiction is another question altogether. And one of the things that psychologists wrestle with is, when there is problem gaming, who is at fault? What is the thing? And what a lot of psychologists have suggested is, in fact, that it's not necessarily the game itself that's the problem. That when they find cases of problem gaming, it is almost always related to some other psychological problem. So it's not the game itself, it's that the game becomes a coping mechanism for someone who is struggling with depression, or who has lost a job, or had a recent breakup with a significant other, that kind of thing. And the game is just nicely tailored to help you escape those particular problems. Right. And then it's not really the game that's at fault. It's the problem. Yeah, it's the problem that the person is facing at that point that's the issue. That's the psychological sort of scholarly side of things. There's also the game industry practices here that are actually kind of important to talk about as well, and that is that there are, in fact, conscious attempts by some game makers, not all game makers, but some game makers, to actually employ psychological theories in order to design games that are purposely hard for people to put down.
You think?
Yeah. Well, we kind of laugh about addictive games because I mean, all game makers want to make a game that is hard to put down in a sense, right? Because you want a game that is compelling. Because if it isn't, then you've as a designer you haven't done your job properly. Mm-hmm. But there is also this whole so behavioral psychology has found that people play more compulsively if they do X, Y, or Z in the game design, and therefore we're going to put those things in order to hook people. And that kind of very Machiavellian, kind of scary, psychological, manipulative approach is in fact consciously employed by some game makers. Right. Most of these companies are in what's called the free-to-play space, and if you're not a gamer, free-to-play are casual games that you can download and start playing for free, and usually they make their money by encouraging you to purchase things in the game. The biggest games in the world now are actually in the free-to-play space. So I don't know if this number is still current, but last spring I had heard from someone in the games industry that the game Clash of Clans makes $8 million a day. And that works out to about over $3 billion a year. You do not have to pay a cent to play Clash of Clans, but the game is designed in such a way that it's a lot easier if you pay to play the game, and it is designed in such a way to sort of encourage you to make those payments, essentially. And obviously, it's very successful, and that is a serious problem. When these kinds of games first started invading the market, there was some real worry about compulsive behavior that would lead people to spend tens of thousands of dollars when they really didn't have that kind of money to spend. So that's a real other problem with this whole thing as well. So I think when we're talking about this as Christians, I think we do need to grapple with this pretty seriously. I cannot tell you how many students I have seen over the years at my university who gaming has been a bad distraction for them, and it has impacted their grades, in some cases leading to failures or withdrawals or things like that. And again, I think usually in those cases, there's some other psychological stuff happening, that people are struggling with depression or problems with their family or whatever else that they're struggling with. But games don't help in those situations. They are convenient escapes, and I think we have to monitor our gameplay pretty closely. And I say this as someone who would much rather play another round of Hearthstone than grade a paper. And there are more than a few nights every semester where the paper loses out, and it shouldn't. So I'm not saying this as someone who's managed all of this perfectly. But I do think that we do need to take the issue of problem gaming seriously. It is a real issue. But at the same time, I don't think that we should overreact about it. So let me put it in a proper perspective. If someone were to read, say, 30 hours a week, read books 30 hours a week, which works out to roughly 4 hours a day, we would look at that, we'd say, boy, that person reads a lot. But we'd probably almost say it admiringly.
Right.
It would be something that we would be looking at and we go, gosh, that is very impressive when someone does that. But if someone were to play 30 hours of games a week, which is 4 hours a day, I would challenge you to find too many people, non-gamers especially, who would not say, there's a problem there, right? And what they would be tempted to use the word addiction at that point. They're playing so much, they're addicted. I never hear anyone say that person is addicted to reading. But I do hear people say that person is addicted to gaming. Right? And now, you can
My
argue,
wife would tell you reading addictions do exist. She's married to one.
Yeah, absolutely. And like my oldest daughter, she's 13, and she is she's a voracious reader. I mean, she was just showing me the stack of books as she went through this week. And sometimes we have a hard time getting her to, set the table or do her homework or whatever because she's busy reading these novels. She likes games too, by the way.
Good.
But especially novels. She just reads them like crazy. And very few parents I know of would be worried about that. But if we're just talking about straight amount of time, why would we not call that addiction and we would call the other one addiction? So I think that is a really, really important, discrepancy that we need to pay attention to. That is one of those indicators that maybe it's not actually video games that are the problem. Maybe it's our cultural presuppositions that are the problem. So I think that's really, really important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about games. Now, of course, you can also argue about, well, the cognitive benefits of reading are better than, they make you smarter than games. And we can get into that maybe in a few minutes. But that's actually sort of beside the point. We're talking about amount of time, right? And the fact is that you can spend just as much time on another medium as games, and people won't say that you're addicted. So I think, when people are on the outside, they have to understand that just because you don't like games or it doesn't appeal to you doesn't mean that it's an invalid activity. I think the bigger question is we have to be evaluating again on self-evaluating of the effects. Is playing games taking you away from other healthy stuff? I mean, we could talk about any number of things that it could take you away from. I mean, if you're a student, homework; if you're a professor, grading; if you're, your devotion life, your prayer life, your, relationships with others. Are games doing that? If you're playing 5 hours of games a week, which is not very much, but it's doing those things, it's taking you away from your homework and it's taking you away from other things, then maybe you have to cut down. If you're doing 20 hours of games a week and you're still holding down a good job, you have good relationships, and you're doing what you need to do, you're fulfilling your obligations, then maybe 20 hours is a good level for you, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not a question of amount, it's more a question of mind space. What's it doing to you? How much is it taking up? Is it occupying you? Is it taking you away from things? And if it's doing those bad things, if it's sort of pulling you away, then you need to start identifying the root issue there. Is it the games? Is it games particularly that are doing this to you? Or is there some other problem in your life that you're trying to run away from? In which case, you got to face that. You got to start dealing with that particular problem, however that means, counseling or prayer or whatever it is that you need to do in that particular case. And maybe sometimes it does mean cutting back on games or eliminating games altogether, but it may be that there are other things that you need to deal with first.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone before we follow up that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. My guest here is Dr. Kevin Schut here. He's a professor who specializes in video games, of all things. And if you want to support the work that we're doing here, well, you can go to my website, deeperwatersapologetics.com. Help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries on the side. There's a link in there. It takes you to Risen Jesus. You've gone to the right place. That's the ministry of my in-laws, Mike and Debbie Lacona. And you make your donation there. You get in touch with me, or my wife, Allie, or Mike, or Debbie, and say, hey, I made a donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. Maybe make sure we get your donation. It will be tax deductible. You can also buy ebooks that I've either written or co-written, such as A Creed for All Ages, the Apostles' Creed, and Today's Christian, Defining Inerrancy, Groundless, God and Natural Disasters. And guys, you can also do something, you can buy jewelry with us. We got a link at our site to do that too. Says, guys, you might not have noticed this, but women tend to like jewelry. I mean, my wife even has an allergy to nickel. She still likes to wear jewelry when she can. And if you want to get those good brownie points with her, this is a good way to do it. And whatever you purchase from our store, 25% of it goes to Deeper Waters. And like I tell you guys, you can buy something, and you can buy it to make up for that screw up that you recently did with a woman in your life, or you can buy something as insurance for that big screw up that you're going to soon make with that woman in your life. Now, Dr. Scoot, do you have any organization you'd like to see people donate to?
Well, I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but my university is one that's close to my heart, Trinity Western University, and we are trying to make God's kingdom real in the world of higher education and impact Canada and around the world. We have a lot of American students at our university as well, and so Trinity Western University is something that's close to my heart. If you're at all interested in learning more about us, you can go to our website, www.twu.ca. I also am starting up a game development program at TWU, and so I think maybe a little bit later in the podcast we can talk a little bit about Christians making games, and I can explain a little bit more about that. We are just starting that process up, hope to launch next fall, and we are looking for partners to help with that financially and in terms of recruiting. And we don't actually have a web page up yet. That's going to be up in the next month or two. But if people are at all interested in that, you can certainly contact me through TWU, and we'd be happy to have a conversation about that as well.
Yeah, and to get back to addiction, right quick before we go on to the next topic. So when the new game comes out, though, and everyone is suddenly playing that one for a few days or so, that doesn't really qualify as addiction, does it?
Not in my books. I mean, temporary, setting aside time for a major thing. I mean, in the Middle Ages, there was festivals half the year for various saints. And it was, a time of community coming together and celebrating and not doing a whole lot of work. And I think that's a normal kind of thing. People do this in all cultures. It's not just a Western thing. Everyone does this. And I think that it's the same kind of thing. You're taking a bit of a holiday to do a cultural thing. And for many people, they do this together or they talk about it together. So, a temporary holiday to play a game, that's not addiction. No, addiction is when games regularly overtake things that you should be doing otherwise. And I think sort of temporary obsessions with novels or movies or television shows or, binge watching, playing a game, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about problem gaming. We're talking about gaming that regularly interferes with everyday life and the things that you should be doing.
And let's talk about yet another controversial thing with video games that people talk about. I can think of two characters right off. Tifa Lockhart from Final Fantasy VII and Lara Croft from the Tomb Raider series. Let's just say there was one reason guys really like these characters in games. And you've said you got 3 daughters, and I'm sure you wouldn't like them depicted the way a lot of women are depicted in video games, because only in an RPG can a woman be wearing a very, very light bikini type armor, and somehow it's protective.
Right. Yeah, the chainmail bikini is one of the great jokes of the fantasy gaming world because it leaves the torso completely unprotected, but somehow the game mechanics respect it, and it does highlight a long-term kind of sexism and denigration of women, sort of a representation of women as really only good for their looks and not for much else. You get more complicated characters with someone like Lara Croft, who is, definitely highly sexualized, but is also highly capable and not just a princess waiting to be rescued. But it's certainly a mixed blessing. And that kind of trope is a very long-running one in video games. It is one that has, that for many years really kept women out of the gaming because they were seeing characters that they just didn't want to play with, and because it was offensive or it was irritating. And gaming culture itself is often deeply hostile to women. That women are patronized or hit on or screamed at by guys, and both in online settings and in real life sometimes. And that problem does continue to today. That having been said, the good news is that gaming has become it's just like the violence thing. If you want to look for stuff that does not have offensive sexual content, it's not hard. There's lots and lots of games out there that don't sort of indulge that sort of swimsuit model eye candy kind of thing, where girls can play games where they're the hero instead of the prize to be won. And that kind of thing is certainly a positive. And even in the time since I wrote the book and published it a few years back, I would say that there's in many ways been some really positive steps forward. But the whole Gamersgate controversy that actually made national news media a couple of years ago is actually a very good example of the fact that it's not that traditional devaluing of women has not gone away. And the kind of hostility, whether you like the politics of the people who were at the center of this or not, the fact that people who disagreed with them, the people who were complaining about Gamersgate received death threats and rape threats, and had to leave their house because they were documented online so that harassers could actually go find them in real life. That indicates something of the residual hostility and problem that no one should have to deal with. That it's games. It's generally for entertainment, and that's a loss of perspective. So, for me as a Christian, what's critical is that both men and women can live out their calling to be God's image bearers. And I realize that within the Christian community, there are a lot of different interpretations of how that should play out. And I don't want to get into the very contested areas there, because there's lots of big fights within the church about this. But I think that is something that we can at least all agree on, that everyone should be treated with respect, whether they are a man or a woman, and that everyone should be given the ability to live out their calling as God's image bearers. And that's the case that I make in the book as well, that there should be that space. And I do think that the good news is that as I say, that it is moving in a positive direction there. And I'm not worried about my daughters playing games, because there are lots of games out there that they can play that are not, disturbing and problematic and that kind of stuff.
Can you tell us a bit about Gamersgate in case some people are listening and haven't heard about it?
Yeah, sorry. So for those who didn't hear about this, because it did make national news headlines, it was not a proud moment for the gaming community. There was the problem is it's a very complicated story. So and I don't really want to get into all the details. But basically, a gaming journalist, a female gaming journalist, broke up with someone, and her ex-boyfriend wrote a letter about how she was sleeping around and had been cheating on him with another game journalist. Oh no, sorry, she was a game developer. Sorry, she was a female game developer, and she broke up with this guy. This guy wrote a letter about how she got preferential treatment in gaming gaming coverage because she was sleeping with a games journalist, and this blew up in the gaming community. And the game and basically the people who were upset about this, the gamers who were upset about this, took on this label of Gamergate, arguing that the gaming press was full of people who were corrupting journalism, games journalism, in the name of political correctness and things like that. the people who were accused, the journalists and the game developers who were accused of being pro political correctness. The term that was used was social justice warrior, and that was seen as a denigration, a bad term. The social justice warriors pushed back and said, no, this is about you being sexist. And there was a huge fight on Twitter. It got very nasty. And that was when many of the Gamergaters, the people who were against what they saw as political correctness, started, doing death threats and doing some of the things that I mentioned there. And I realized that probably people listening to this podcast will have a lot of different political viewpoints. And so I know this gets into some controversial stuff. But I think we can all agree that leveling death threats at people of a different and rape threats and things like that of a different political persuasion as you is not an acceptable Christian way of doing it. And it does reveal sort of a tension over gender relations within the video game world.
Mm-hmm. I agree entirely. Now let's talk about making video games, because you do have something in there. You want to get to that too.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the big mistakes we often make is kind of like when we make movies and such and TV shows. We make movies and TV shows that other Christians want to go and see, but no one else will really care to go and see. So we're very good at reaching ourselves.
Right. I think that's a very, very good, succinct way of summarizing it. Christian culture makers, when they make explicitly Christian culture, are usually only preaching to the choir. Now, preaching to the choir is often used as a denigrating term, and I don't think that's always fair, because I think it's okay to reach Christians with Christian material for Christians. But if we think that is reaching out to the general world, then we are deeply mistaken at that point. So there's nothing wrong with making an explicitly Christian film. There's nothing wrong with making an explicitly Christian game. There's nothing wrong with making an explicitly Christian podcast. These are all good things. They are reaching and teaching Christians. And as long as we understand it as such, I think that's fine. But I think we are also called as Christian culture makers to enter into the larger Christian arena and to bring Jesus to people in a way that is real to them, in a way that will change their lives. And on this score, I think if you interviewed most Christian game makers, they would agree with me when I say we have largely failed on that count. There are very, very few explicitly Christian games out there that are well made and that reach anyone other than a clearly Christian audience at that point. So this is something that I wrote about in the book at length after interviewing a whole bunch of Christians in the game industry and talking about, okay, so what should be the attitude of Christians going to work in the games industry? And really, a lot of what we're talking about is true of Christians working in the film industry, in publishing, in radio, in television. So in some senses, this is not new, but because Christians are so far behind on games, it is sort of new to this particular sector. And there's a couple of different ways to approach this. There's one way to approach Christians in games is to talk about making games that are, in fact, explicitly Christian. And on that score, like I said, the results to this point have been pretty weak in general. Most of the games are very poor quality, reach a very small audience, tend to be on the preachy side, and often aren't particularly fun to play, which is really the main measure right there. There are a few exceptions. I have been sort of involved in a very light advisory capacity with a game called the Aetherlight, which is spelled Aether, light, L-I-G-H-T, one word, Aetherlight, which is an explicit allegory to Christian that teaches the Bible. But it is done in the form of a very fun for kids. It's aimed at sort of early teen ages. It's done in a way that it's a very fun game to play, and the artistic quality of it is very high. And I do recommend that game to anyone who's interested in something like that. And because it's written as an allegory, if you were not a Christian, you certainly would not necessarily find it preachy. You might not even necessarily catch all of the references to Bible stuff, but they actually are marketing it for Sunday school classes and stuff like that, and they have appropriate study guides that go with it. And my kids have played it and they really like it, and that's a good sign. And it's a well done game, but it's really sort of a standalone in many ways. So that side of things could certainly develop. We still haven't seen a sort of a Veggie Tales for video games kind of moment yet, and I think that there's nothing on the horizon yet. I think the Etherlight could be that, but it hasn't reached a huge audience yet, and so that's something that's worth spreading the word about. But I think that's certainly one valid thing for Christians to work on. But a lot of the Christians I talked to said, a lot of being Christian in the gaming industry is not necessarily about publishing games that are explicitly Christian necessarily. There's a couple of different ways that game workers can do this. One of them is the allegory thing, that telling stories that sort of stealth in Jesus. I mean, it's sort of the C.S. Lewis gold standard with the Chronicles of Narnia, right? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is an explicit Christian allegory, and Aslan dying is the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and it's a fairly obvious thing. But even if you don't like that message or you don't know it, you can still read the book, and it's just a great story in and of itself, right? And that's what a lot of Christian game makers are aspiring to do. But I think even more broadly, just telling stories full of hope and joy and peace, and making games that are high quality and do something different, non-violent creative games. Those are wonderful to do, and they build God's kingdom simply by encouraging healthy creativity. And a lot of Christians are aiming to do that. And what's great is that there seems to be an increasing body of Christian game makers out there now that are starting to think about that kind of thing. And the capacity of Christian game makers to lead the culture and do something really different and powerful is what I'm really excited about. And recently there was a game that came out, I think it was the spring of 2015 when it came out, called That Dragon Cancer. And this is not a fun game. It is a heavily narrative game. It's very point and click. It's actually almost not a game. It's really the mechanics of it are very, very simple. It's more like an interactive movie, but we call it a game because it kind of fits in that category. And it's the story of Ryan and Amy Green and their child who was diagnosed with terminal cancer when he was just over a year old, and then managed to make it for 4 more years before he finally succumbed to the cancer. And the game is all about their family's journey with this thing, and it is a groundbreaking video game. It is. I recommend it to everyone. It's not an easy game to play, and if you have suffered from cancer or have cancer in your family, it is especially difficult to play through just emotionally. But it is one of the most powerful pieces of art in the video game world that has been done for the last several years, and it was widely recognized with awards and press and all the rest of that because of that. And this family is a Christian family, and they talk about their faith throughout the entire game, and it is very explicit. It is not an evangelistic game. It's not trying to proselytize people, to convert them to Christianity. It's a Christian family talking about their walk through suffering with God and telling this story in a way with such great integrity and such power that it cannot help but transform the world around them, and it has. It's made a major impact in people's lives, and these are Christians doing groundbreaking art in the world of video games. And to me, that's a powerful model. I don't think that everyone has to do tearjerkers and really emotionally difficult games. I think you can have fun, frothy games as well. There's a guy named Jay Tolan who does a game about a clown, sort of a weird-looking clown going around and doing a story adventure, and it's a powerful game too. But it's fun. It's sort of silly, and and I am struggling to remember the name of the game. I can't remember it. So I'll maybe you can put that up on your podcast at some point. But Jay Tolan, Tholen, does some really interesting game work as well, and he's a Christian. And it's not like necessarily deep and profound, but it's well done art, and that's a really, really important thing as well. My passion for this is to get Christians into the industry, and this gets into the third way that Christians talk about impacting the industry, is just by being there, being salt and light, and being in the boardrooms and having discussions about things, maybe not even affecting the story of a game, the genre of a game, but building relationships with other people in the industry so that they can actually show what it means to love Jesus and how that can change people's lives. And you can do that in public relations. You can do that as an animator. You can do that as a business person. All of those roles. We need Christians in that industry so that they can show people. They can show people what it means to follow Jesus in a way that transforms lives. Maybe not in the game itself, but in the day-to-day work of the people in the industry. And so I mentioned earlier that we are setting up a game development program at Trinity Western University, and this is the idea behind it, that we want to train people, we want to train young students, Christians, to be great game makers and to go into the world and to share who they are, and in so doing build the kingdom of God in the world, whichever part of the industry we're talking about. We're going to train. They're going to come in and they're going to work as a studio. We're going to have them specialize in one of 5 areas. They can be designers and writers, or they can be game artists, or they can do sound and music design for games, or they can do the software side of things, or they can do the marketing and management side of things. Those are all things that we're going to be training Christians to do so that they can go out and they can be prepared to actually make a difference in the industry. And we hope to launch with our first group of students next fall. The province here is still approving the program, but we're hoping to launch it next September. And we're really, really hoping that this will be a way to make a difference in a gaming industry that in many ways, there's not a strong Christian presence there.
Well, I did follow the little breadcrumbs you were dropping, and I did some looking up just now. I think the game you're looking for is Dropsy the Clown.
Dropsy. There we go.
Yeah.
Yep. Dropsy.
And when you were talking about that dragon cancer, I couldn't help but think that that's probably going to be very relevant to many people, because as you probably know, last week, the Christian Apologetics Board mourned the loss of Nabil Qureshi to cancer.
Right.
And my wife and I watched the funeral online, and such a great impact, and I think that there's a game out there about that. That's really incredible. So, and you've already talked about a place that people can go to if they want to be making games. And what other steps do you think someone wanting to go into the game making industry should follow?
Well, I talked to someone who, one of the guys I interviewed for my book, is a very successful game maker. And he talked about one of the things that's really, really important, however you're going to do this, is don't go into the industry just because you have a passion for God, although that is clearly important. Go into the industry because you're going to be a good game maker. Because if you're not going to be a good game maker and you go in for missionary reasons, you might almost do more damage than good, simply because you're not going to get the respect that you need there. So it's really, really important to Christians who are interested, in gaming the gaming industry as a mission field and games as a mission field. You need to understand that in order to gain credibility, you need to be good at what you're doing. And there's lots of different university programs out there where you can make video games. And so mine, of course, I'm excited about because there are very few Christian universities and colleges that are doing this. As far as I know, there's the only other program I know of really that's very strong in this regard is Oklahoma Christian University. But I really believe in our program, and I think it'll prepare Christians to go into that world. But you don't have to go to a Christian university to do that. There are other good programs out there. The key is that if you're going to get into the industry, maybe not even formal university training is absolutely necessary, although I think it's a real benefit and is more and more common nowadays in game workers. But if you're going to do it, you need to get good at it. You need to get good at it. However that happens, do our program at Trinity Western University, do a program at a big university, state school, just do a standard computing science degree, or do an art degree, animation degree, or just take a few courses in those areas and then, self-train. Whatever it is that you do, you really, really need to get good at it so that you can gain respect and you can gain credibility so that when you speak in that industry, people actually will listen to you. And I think that that's a really, really important piece of advice. There's lots of different avenues to get into the games industry. None of them are easy. All of them are difficult. I'm excited about my program, but I can't guarantee my students that they will absolutely get the job that they want. We're going to do our best to equip them, but it's a competitive world. It's a competitive industry to get into. But it's really, really important that you get good at it. And so for me, that's a primary calling for our program at Trinity Western University. We want to make sure that we are training students who will be valuable to employers, who will really have a clear artistic vision, know how to work in a budget, know how to work on a team, know how to be lifelong learners. These are all things that are critical to succeeding in the industry.
We've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left of discussion time, so let's try and cover one other section very briefly. And that's that I remember when I lived in Charlotte, shortly after I got married even, my wife knew every Sunday night I was going to go to some friend's house. They were identical twins, grooms in my wedding. We were going to play Smash Brothers until 9 p.m. or so, and then their dad would take us out and we'd all go bowling together. And that was my guys' night out, and she knew about it. Every now and then she'd call if she wanted something, and sometimes, depending on what she wanted, I could be heading straight home. But I think a lot of us who are gamers need to know about the social side of gaming, including how can we use this with evangelism?
Absolutely. So that's a great topic, and again, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to be really quick here. Gaming is inherently social, and that's a very powerful thing. It builds community. Those of you who are not gamers probably don't understand this, but it's one of those things where if you're at a gaming convention or something like that, you can sit down with complete strangers and strike up friendships simply because you have the game to tie yourself together. And it's true of a lot of other hobbies. I mean, if you're into stamp collecting, you're into bird watching, whatever it is, people who do things together tend to build connections. But gaming is such a widespread one, and it really does form a great basis for socialization, for really getting to know each other and knowing complete strangers. And yes, that can be an in for evangelization, absolutely. It's interesting that Christian gamers often like to stick together because there is a certain amount of hostility in certain parts of gaming culture towards Christianity. It's not universal by any stretch of the imagination. Most people are fine with you being Christian and don't really care one way or the other. But it's one of those things where it's certainly a world that can use a Christian presence. Now, I think, and this does get into what do you count as healthy evangelism? What is a positive way to approach evangelism? I think nowadays in most of these cultures, preaching at people is a non-starter. It is the surest way to turn people off and shut their ears to the gospel of Christ. And what I think is really, really important is building relationships with people. And thankfully, games are great for that. If you're really serious about making a difference for Jesus in the gaming world, go find a non-Christian guild, join it, and just make friends there. And that to me is one of the most powerful things you can do, because once you get invested in other people's lives, it will just come out naturally based on who you are and in the conversations that you have. And the conversations get really big. This gaming group that I'm part of occasionally on Tuesday nights, a board gaming group, but we do get into some really interesting discussions sometimes. And they know, the non-Christians in the group know which of us are believers and why and what we believe. And that hasn't necessarily converted them or brought them to Christ, but it's a presence of Jesus in their life. And I think that's really, really powerful. And I think that, people going into into gaming communities with that kind of attitude, that I'm just going to be salt and light, that I'm going to be friends with people, can have a major impact for the kingdom that way.
Yeah, the man who was the best man at my wedding, he was my roommate when I moved to seminary, and we're good friends to this day. How did it start? He saw me on a theology forum that I'm still a part of, really liked what he saw, and he included in his message to me a Final Fantasy avatar. The friendship was sealed from that point on, and when we talk, a lot of times it's still Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy. And this is the way a lot of us think. You make instant best friends. And I say that if you're a Christian and you're really good at video games, people will respect you too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So go out and be the best gamer you can, because it's for the glory of God, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Schut, I have to say, this has been a fascinating talk. You know, we've really only scratched the surface on so many topics, because there's other things you could discuss, such as educational value of video games and such. But if people want to get the book, it's Of Games and God, A Christian Exploration of Video Games. As of this recording, the Kindle version is $11.53 and the paperback is $11.31. And as I was telling you before the show started, this is one book that when I reached the end, I realized, wait, that was the last page? Like, I wanted to keep going. I was kind of disappointed there wasn't more to say in here. And hopefully there'll be even more volumes and such coming out. Dr. Schut, do you have a blog, a website, an email, way that people can get in touch if they want to find out more, or perhaps a way they can play you in a game if they want to do that?
Well, maybe the gaming with me might be a little difficult because I'm not regularly in any one game long enough to actually meet people that way. I tend to flip from one thing to the other pretty quickly, just because I need to try different games. But there are a couple of different websites that I would steer you to. If you want to know about my academic program, the School of the Arts, Media, and Culture at Trinity Western University, you can go to twu.ca/SAMC, SAMC, and you can find out about some of the programs that we have there. If you're interested in the further conversation about Christianity and video games, there are a couple of sites that I would push you towards. There is a website called Think Christian, and that's from Reframe Media. And I actually don't have the URL off the top of my head, but if you Google Think Christian, you'll find it, all one word. And I do some writing there sometimes. So does a number of other very talented writers who are deep thinkers about games. There is a website called GameChurch.com, and I mentioned it in my last chapter, and it's funny because I'm almost critical of them in my last chapter, but months after I had finished the manuscript, I got in touch with them, and really the ministry has changed quite a bit since I wrote that, and I wish I could rewrite that chapter because it is an amazing resource, and the man who started it, Mikey Bridges, is an amazing guy, and I would just encourage people. There's quite a growing community there, some great writing and some really good thinking and some videos and everything else. And you could also check out christandpopculture.com, which is another good place for discussions about pop culture in general from a Christian perspective. And lots of interesting conversation going on in all of those areas, not necessarily at a scholarly level always, but that's probably a good thing for many people. And some great conversations, and I would encourage you to look at all of those. We also do have a Facebook page for Of Games and God, and you're certainly welcome to like us there. And when I post things infrequently, then it shows up in your feed, and you can check us out there too.
I think it's thinkchristian.reframemedia.com.
There we go. Yes.
Yeah. And do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the Deeper Waters audience?
You know what? Video games are a major force in our culture, whether you like them or not. And it's important for us as the church to engage them like we engage all other aspects of our culture. And the idea behind Of Games and God was not actually to provide a bunch of answers, but to get a bunch of conversations going so that the church will actually engage this really, really important part of our cultural landscape. And I hope that if you are not a gamer, that you are willing to, learn a little bit about this world, even if you're never actually going to play video games on a regular basis, and learn to understand the people that are involved. And those of you who are gamers, to to be salt and light in that world, to build the kingdom of God in big ways, yes, but also in little ways, just the way that you carry yourself and the way that you interact with the people and the way that you compete and the kinds of things that you say and the kind of things that you do.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Hopefully we'll see you back here again sometime.
Thank you. I'd like to be back sometime.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone that next week we have Don Vaynard on, talking about cults, what they are, how to recognize them, and how to escape them. For now, I'm Nick Peters, signing off and wishing you some good gaming. Bye for now.